The wind came down from the peaks like a predator. It was a sound Thomas McKenna had come to know intimately in his 5 years in this valley, not the whisper of summer pines, but the high, hungry scream of a winter that had arrived too soon. Outside, the world was a churning chaos of white. Inside the log cabin he'd built with his own 2 hands, the only sounds were the crackle of the stove and the soft breathing of his daughters. Lucy, all of 4 years old, was a tangle of dark hair and worn wool blanket on the pallet near the hearth. Emma, 7 going on 17, sat at the rough-hewn table, her small face a mask of concentration as she tried to stitch a button back onto her father's worn shirt. Her stitches were clumsy, angry little things, a testament to a world that had taken her mother and left her with a needle too big for her fingers. Thomas's own hands, calloused and wide, felt useless. He could fell a 100-foot pine, frame a house, and track a buck for 2 days, but he couldn't make the lumpy porridge taste right or braid hair the way Sarah had. His gaze fell upon the small, dove-tailed pine box on the mantelpiece. Sarah's recipes. He'd taken it down a dozen times in the year since she'd been gone, and a dozen times he'd put it back. The neat, curling script on the cards a pain too sharp to bear. Tonight, the loneliness of the storm pushed him. He reached for it, his thumb tracing the faded letters spelling Zara's kitchen. He lifted the lid. The scent of cinnamon and dried lavender, faint but stubborn, rose to meet him. Asterisk apple brown Betty, sourdough starter, spiced peach preserves. Each card was a ghost. He ran a finger over the recipe for her buttermilk biscuits, the edges smudged with flour from her hands. A lump formed in his throat. Thick and heavy as unshed snow, this box held the heart of their home, a heart he no longer knew how to make beat. That's when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the storm, a frantic, rhythmic thudding against the heavy oak door. Emma's head shot up, her eyes wide with alarm. Thomas put a finger to his lips, gesturing for her to stay quiet. He moved silently to the wall where his rifle rested on 2 wooden pegs. No one traveled in a blizzard like this, not unless they were desperate or dangerous. He held the rifle loosely in one arm and lifted the heavy bar on the door with the other. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice a low growl meant to carry over the wind. A woman's voice, thin and torn by the gale, answered, "Please, shelter, just for the storm." Thomas hesitated. A woman alone. It was a risk, but the thought of leaving any one man, woman, or child to the mercy of this blizzard gnawed at a deeper, more human part of him. It was a law of the mountains, unspoken but unbreakable. He opened the door a crack. The wind tore it from his grasp, slamming it wide open and filling the cabin with a swirl of snow and frigid air. A figure stumbled in, collapsing more than stepping over the threshold, and fell to her knees on the bearskin rug. It was a woman, maybe 25. Though hardship had etched years onto her face, her dress was a sodden mess of cheap calico, torn at the hem and clinging to her thin frame. Her dark hair was plastered to her scalp, and her face was pale with a bluish tint to her lips. She was shivering so violently her teeth chattered like loose stones in a bucket, but it was her eyes that held him. They were wide and dark, filled not with fear, but with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. Without a word, Thomas shut the door, plunging the room back into the warm, fire-lit quiet. The woman looked down at the puddle forming around her on the rug. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Your floor." She made a move to get up, to shift off the rug, but her limbs wouldn't obey. Thomas set the rifle aside. "Stay put," he said, his tone gruff to cover the knot of pity in his chest. "Get yourself warm before you worry about my floor." He grabbed a thick wool blanket from a nearby chest. As he draped it over her trembling shoulders, he saw Emma standing by the table, her small body rigid. Her eyes narrowed with suspicion. She clutched the shirt she was mending like a shield. The woman, Catherine Walsh, she later told them her name was. Didn't ask for anything. After a few minutes of soaking in the heat from the stove, her shivering subsided enough for her to stand. She carefully removed her worn, soaked boots, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't leave them dripping on the floorboards, but placed them on the stone hearth, far enough from the fire to dry slowly without cracking the leather. It was a small thing, a piece of practical knowledge that spoke of a life spent taking care of what little one had. Thomas ladled out a bowl of the venison stew from the pot simmering on the stove. It was his own concoction, hearty but bland. He handed it to her with a piece of dry bread. She took it with a quiet, "Thank you, sir," and ate with a hunger that was painful to watch. Yet she did so with a strange, innate grace, not spilling a drop. When she finished, she washed her own bowl and spoon in the basin, her movements economical and tidy. Thomas offered her the spot on the pallet where Lucy was sleeping, intending to move his daughter to the bed he shared with Emma, but Catherine shook her head. "The floor by the fire is more than enough," she insisted, her voice gaining some strength. "I wouldn't want to be a bother." He didn't argue. He gave her another dry blanket, and she curled up on the floor, pulling the wool up to her chin. Within minutes, the steady rhythm of her breathing joined the sleeping sighs of his daughters and the howling of the storm. Thomas sat at the table for a long time, watching the three of them. Emma had finally given up her vigil and climbed into their bed. But he knew she wasn't asleep. He could feel her watching him, watching the stranger. In the flickering firelight, the cabin felt different, fuller. It was a feeling that unsettled him, a warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. He looked at Sarah's recipe box, its lid still open on the mantelpiece. He felt a sharp, sudden pang of guilt, as if he had committed some unspoken betrayal. He closed the lid, the soft click of the wood sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Catherine drifted in a sea of warmth, a luxury she hadn't felt in so long she'd nearly forgotten its existence. For months, sleep had been a shallow, fearful thing, snatched in drafty barns or the crowded, noisy corners of boarding houses. Here, cocooned in wool with the scent of pine smoke and the deep, steady heat of a well-tended fire, her body sank into a profound rest. She woke not to the gray light of a city alley, but to a soft, silver radiance filtering through a small window. The storm had broken. A profound silence pressed in on the cabin, the kind that only follows a great snowfall. The first thing she saw was a pair of wide, curious blue eyes staring at her. A small girl, no older than 4, with a thumb stuck firmly in her mouth. "Hello," Catherine whispered, her voice still rough with sleep. The little girl, Lucy, giggled and hid behind her hands. From the bed in the corner, another, older pair of eyes watched her. They were Thomas's eyes, a stormy gray, set in a small, guarded face. This was Emma. There was no curiosity here, only a silent, unwavering judgment. Catherine felt a familiar flush of shame creep up her neck. She knew what she looked like to this child astray, a piece of driftwood washed up by the storm. A woman alone in this part of the country was either a widow, a missionary, or something else entirely, and the something else was never looked upon with kindness. She folded the blankets she had used into a neat, tight rectangle, just as she'd been taught long ago, and placed them on the chest. The man, Thomas, was trying to coax the fire back to life in the cook stove. He moved with a heavy, burdened air, his shoulders slumped as if carrying more than just the weight of a long night. He was trying to make breakfast, clumsily measuring oats into a pot. "Sir," Catherine said softly, "may I?" He turned, surprised. He looked from her to the pot of lumpy, watery oats, and a dull flush rose on his weathered cheeks. He was a proud man, not used to accepting help, especially not in his own kitchen. But he was also a practical one. He gave a short, jerky nod and stepped aside. Catherine moved to the stove, It felt strangely familiar, her hands finding the salt crock, the water pail, the wooden spoon, as if she had done this 1,000 times before. She added a pinch of salt, a splash more water, and began to stir with a steady, patient rhythm. Soon, the kitchen filled with the warm, comforting smell of properly cooked oatmeal. She ladled it into 3 bowls. Lucy ate hers with gusto, smiling at Catherine over her spoon with a milk mustache on her upper lip. Thomas ate his slowly, his eyes on his bowl, a complex and unreadable expression on his face. Emma refused to come to the table. She sat on the edge of the bed, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Emma," Thomas said, his voice low but firm, "come eat." "I'm not hungry," she mumbled, her gaze fixed on Catherine. The rejection was a physical blow, sharper than any harsh word. Catherine saw in the girl's eyes a fierce, protective loyalty to a memory she was intruding upon. But beneath the anger, she saw something else, too, a flicker of longing. The little girl was hungry, not just for food, but for the simple, everyday act of being cared for, and she hated that this stranger was the one providing it. Catherine understood that kind of loyalty. She understood what it was to guard a memory so fiercely it left no room for anything else. She said nothing, simply leaving the 3rd bowl on the table, still steaming. After their silent breakfast, Thomas pulled on his heavy coat and went out to check on his livestock and clear a path. The world he stepped into was transformed, draped in a thick, pristine blanket of snow that softened every sharp edge and muffled every sound. The air was clean and cold, stinging his lungs. The immediate threat was over, but as he looked back at the smoke curling from his cabin chimney, a new and more complicated storm was gathering inside him. The sight of that woman, Catherine, moving so capably in Sarah's kitchen had shaken him. It had been more than a year of clumsy, half-hearted attempts at housekeeping. More than a year of his girls wearing clothes with rips he couldn't mend and eating meals that were either burned or bland. He had told himself it was enough. They were alive. They were fed. But the quiet competence of this stranger in a single morning had cast a harsh light on all that was missing. It wasn't just Sarah's recipes. It was her presence, her touch, the invisible thread she had woven through their days that made this cabin a home. Catherine had, for a moment, brought a phantom of that feeling back, and it terrified him. It felt like a betrayal. He was replacing Sarah, not in his heart, but in the small, daily rituals that made up a life. He shoveled the snow with hard, angry scoops, the physical labor a welcome distraction from the war in his mind. When he returned, Catherine was showing Lucy how to make a little doll from a scrap of cloth and some yarn. Emma sat apart, pretending to read from a primer, but her eyes kept flicking toward them. The bowl of oatmeal on the table was empty. The sun climbed higher, melting the snow on the roof into a steady drip. Drip, drip from the eaves. The trail to town would be impassable for days, maybe a week. They were trapped here, the 4 of them, in this small wooden box suspended between the memory of a wife and the presence of a stranger. The blizzard outside had ended, but the true storm, the one brewing within the 4 walls of the cabin and inside the quiet chambers of their hearts, had only just begun. The fire in the stove burned bright, but the cold they each carried within them was a far deeper and more stubborn thing. A new hand was now close to the hearth, but whether she was there to tend the flame or to be consumed by it, no one yet knew. 3 days passed in a world of white and quiet. The snow, heavy and deep, held them captive in the valley, a temporary family forged by the storm. For Catherine, these days were a strange and painful dream. She fell into the rhythms of the household as if she'd known them forever. She mended the girls' stockings, her stitches small and even, a stark contrast to Emma's frustrated jabs. She baked bread from Thomas's dwindling flour supply, her hands moving with a muscle memory that surprised even her, kneading and shaping the dough on a board that hadn't been used in over a year. The cabin filled with the scent of it, a smell of life and sustenance that seemed to push back against the lingering grief in the corners. Lucy became her shadow, a small, chattering presence at her elbow, asking endless questions as Catherine churned butter or peeled potatoes. Catherine would answer patiently, her voice soft, and sometimes a genuine smile would touch her lips as she watched the little girl play with the cloth doll she had made. Emma remained a fortress. She spoke only when necessary, her gray eyes following Catherine's every move with a cold, watchful intensity. She was the keeper of her mother's memory, and she saw this stranger as a threat, an erasure of the woman who should have been standing at that stove. Yet, Catherine often saw her hovering near the doorway, listening as Catherine told Lucy a story, or watching from the corner of her eye as she deftly patched a tear in Thomas's shirt. The girl was a knot of conflicting needs, the fierce loyalty to her lost mother warring with a simple, childish desire for a mother's care. Thomas spoke little, but he observed everything. He saw the way Catherine instinctively knew to add a little honey to the oatmeal to tempt Lucy. He saw the neat stacks of firewood she kept by the stove, the clean-swept floor, the way she gently detangled Lucy's hair without a single tear from the child. He saw her quiet dignity, the way she never asked for anything, never presumed, yet filled the empty spaces of their lives with a competence that was both a comfort and a sharp, twisting pain. Each efficient, gentle act was a reminder of Sarah, and simultaneously, a testament to the woman standing before him. He found himself touching the worn leather cord around his neck more often, the cool, smooth weight of Sarah's gold ring beneath his shirt a constant, grounding presence. It was his anchor to the past, but the tides of the present were pulling with an undeniable force. On the fourth morning, the sun rose with a new strength, its light glinting off a million ice crystals. A path was beginning to emerge from the sea of white. The world was stirring again, and the spell of their enforced isolation was broken. Catherine knew it was time to leave. She had nothing to pack but the threadbare shawl she'd arrived in. She washed the breakfast dishes, scoured the porridge pot until it shone, and swept the floor one last time. Her heart was a cold, heavy lump in her chest. Leaving was like tearing a half-healed wound open again. This brief, fragile peace, this illusion of a home, had been a dangerous balm. It had allowed her to forget, just for a moment, who she was, a woman with no destination and a past she couldn't outrun. She found Thomas on the porch, squinting against the brilliant glare of the snow. He was mending a piece of tack, his large hands surprisingly nimble with the awl and thread. The air was crisp and so cold it felt clean. "Mr. McKenna," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "The way looks to be clearing. I must be on my way." He stopped his work but didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the distant, snow-laden peaks. "Where will you go?" he asked, his voice flat. "To Leadville, I suppose. There's always work to be found there." She didn't specify what kind of work a woman alone could find. Laundress, seamstress, a cook in a boarding house. The options were few and the wages meager. Leadville's a rough town for a woman on her own. A bitter smile touched her lips. The world is a rough place for a woman on her own. "Mr. McKenna." She had expected a nod, perhaps a small pouch of coins for her help, a gesture she would have politely refused. She had expected to walk away from this cabin and its occupants and carry the memory of its warmth with her into the cold. She did not expect him to set down his leatherwork and turn to face her, his expression grim, his gray eyes piercing. He took a deep breath, the cold air misting around his lips, and then he said the words that would alter the course of her life. "I need a wife for my girls and you need a home." The words hung in the still air between them, stark and unadorned. Catherine stared at him, certain she had misheard. The proposal was so blunt, so devoid of any sentiment. It sounded like a business transaction, a trade of goods, her for a roof. It was insulting. It was practical. It was, terrifyingly, a lifeline. "Sir, she stammered, her composure shattering. "I've watched you," he continued, his voice low and steady, as if he were explaining the logic of a fence line. "You're good with them. With Lucy. You see what needs doing and you do it. This place, since Sarah passed, it's just been a structure, not a home. The girls need a mother. I'm not enough." The admission cost him dearly. She could see it in the tightening of his jaw. "And you," he went on, his gaze unflinching, "you look like you've been running for a long time. You need a place to stop, a name, protection." He wasn't offering romance. He was offering a contract, a partnership based on mutual desperation. He was offering her a chance to be more than a drifter, to have a purpose beyond mere survival. A wild, hysterical laugh almost escaped her. Wife. Her a woman with a past so shadowed she had learned to live in a perpetual twilight of half-truths and evasions. He saw her as a potential mother, a respectable figure to raise his daughters. He saw a capable woman who could bake bread. He had no idea who he was talking to. The honesty he was offering demanded an honesty in return. A truth so painful she kept it locked away like a cursed thing. She wrapped her arms around herself, the cold seeping into her bones. "Mr. McKenna," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "you are a good man. You've been kinder to me than anyone has in a very long time, and that is why I cannot accept." His brow furrowed in confusion. "I can provide for you. You would want for nothing." "It is not about what you can provide," she said, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "It is about who I am. You speak of giving me a name, but the name I carry now, Catherine Walsh, is not the only one I have used. You see a woman fit to raise your daughters, but you do not see the woman I was before." She had to tell him, to lay the ugliness of her past at his feet and let him see it for what it was. It was the only honorable thing to do. "I lived with a man for 2 years. His name was James Morrison. He was not my husband. He had a wife back in the East. He told me she was sickly, that their marriage was over in all but name. I was young, and I believed him." Her voice was flat, reciting a story she had told herself 1,000 times, trying to strip it of all emotion. "We had a son, Daniel." Just saying the name was like pressing on a deep bruise. She paused, drawing a ragged breath. She instinctively reached into the small pocket sewn on the inside of her dress, her fingers brushing against the worn, folded edges of a tiny photograph. The only thing she had left of him. He was everything. But the fever came to the camp where we were living. It took him in 2 days. After that, after Daniel was gone, James left. He went back to his wife, to his life. I was left with nothing. The people in that town, they looked at me, they said things. I was the woman who had lived in sin, the mother of a child with no name. So I left. I've been moving ever since, taking what work I can find, trying to leave that woman behind." She finished, her throat raw. The silence that followed was immense, broken only by the sound of water dripping from the eaves. She had laid her shame bare for him to see. Now would come the judgment, the cold dismissal. She braced herself for it. Thomas didn't move. He didn't look at her with disgust or pity. His gaze had drifted back to the mountains, his face a mask of stone. He reached up and his fingers closed around the ring on its leather cord. He held it for a long moment, a silent communion with the woman who had given it to him. Catherine watched him, her heart pounding. She saw the conflict in him, the weighing of her confession against the needs of his family. He was a man bound by the strict, unyielding codes of this time and place. A woman's reputation was everything, and she had just admitted to having none. For his daughter's sake, he had to turn her away. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "Everyone has a past, Miss Walsh, things they'd rather forget. I fought in the war. I saw and did things that I don't speak of, things that a man does to survive." He finally turned his gaze back to her. That man, Morrison. He was the one who broke a vow, not you. He took a step closer. I have seen you for 3 days. I saw you put your own boots on the hearth to dry so you wouldn't ruin my rug. Even when you were half frozen. I saw you have the patience to teach my Lucy how to make a doll when I can barely get her to sit still. I see you look at my Emma not with anger for her moods, but with understanding. That is the woman I see. He let go of the ring and let his hand drop. I don't care what name you used before. I don't care about the mistakes you've made or the ones that were made for you. What happened in that town is their shame, not yours. He looked toward the cabin door, where the faint sound of the girls arguing could be heard. My daughters need a woman to teach them how to be strong and kind. I've seen your kindness, Miss Walsh. That's what I need in this house. He paused, his next words locking her in place. I need your kindness more than I need any papers or any past without a blemish. Tears welled in Catherine's eyes, hot and sudden. They weren't tears of sorrow or shame, but of a relief so profound it felt like a physical release. Like a heavy pack she'd been carrying for years had just been lifted from her shoulders. He had looked at the ugliest parts of her life and had not turned away. He had seen the person, not the sinner. This was not a proposal of love, or passion, or even affection. It was a proposal of mutual respect. It was a recognition of two broken souls finding a practical way to mend themselves by mending a broken home. It was a choice, a brave, terrifying choice. She thought of the cold nights ahead, the lonely roads, the judgmental eyes. She thought of a future of drifting, of always looking over her shoulder. Then she thought of the scent of baking bread, of Lucy's small hand in hers, of the steady, quiet presence of this man who saw her, truly saw her. Slowly, deliberately, she nodded. Yes, she whispered. It was not a promise of happily ever after. It was the laying of the first, uncertain stone in the foundation of a new life. They were partners now. Love, if it was to come at all, would have to find its own way, grow in its own time, like a stubborn wildflower pushing up through the hard, frozen ground of the Rockies. Their agreement was not sealed with a kiss or a vow, but with a simple, shared meal. The next day, Thomas rode to the small mining town of Redemption, a name that felt both too grand and strangely fitting, and returned not with a preacher but with a circuit judge, a weary man whose legal authority was carried in a dusty satchel. In the main room of the cabin, with Emma and Lucy as silent, wide-eyed witnesses, Thomas McKenna and Catherine Walsh were joined in a marriage of convenience. There was no ring, only a solemn entry in the judge's ledger and a handshake that was as much a business deal as a sacred pact. And so, the quiet days began. The raw, desperate edges of their arrangement softened into the rhythms of a shared life. Catherine rose before the sun, her first act always to stir the embers in the stove back to life. The scent of coffee and frying bacon soon filled the cabin. A daily summons to the table, meals, which had been haphazard, lonely affairs, became fixed points in the day, eaten together at the rough-hewn table. In the evenings, the cabin was filled with a new kind of quiet, not the empty silence of loss, but the companionable quiet of industry. The scratch of Emma's pencil on her slate, the soft thumps as Lucy built towers with wooden blocks, and the whisper of Catherine's needle weaving through worn fabric. Catherine's presence was a language of quiet care. She discovered Thomas's preference for coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe. She learned that Lucy was afraid of the dark and would only sleep if a small lantern was left burning low. She noticed the way Emma's brow furrowed in frustration over her sums and would appear at her side, not to give the answer, but to ask a gentle question that illuminated the path. She moved through their lives with a soft-footed grace, patching the holes in their world, both literal and figurative. She taught the girls to knit, their clumsy fingers slowly learning to loop the yarn, turning a simple string into something warm and useful. At night, when she tucked Lucy in, She would hum a lullaby, a melody so old and simple it felt like a prayer. Thomas worked his land with a renewed vigor, the gnawing anxiety in his gut easing for the first time in a year. He no longer had to rush back from the woodlot, worried about the girls being alone or the fire going out. He knew Catherine was there, a steady, capable presence holding the center. Yet, this new peace was a troubled one. He would watch her across the dinner table, the firelight catching the soft curve of her cheek, and a warmth would spread through his chest that had nothing to do with gratitude. It felt like contentment. And the moment he named it, a cold wave of guilt would wash over him. It felt like a betrayal to Sarah, to the fierce, all-consuming love they had shared. He would find himself at his woodworking bench in the barn, his hands shaping a piece of pine, his mind wrestling with ghosts. How could this quiet happiness feel so right and so wrong at the same time? His gaze would often fall on Sarah's recipe box, still on the mantelpiece. It became a silent barometer of his inner turmoil. Some evenings, he would take it down, his thumb tracing her name. He'd lift the lid, breathe in the faint scent of her kitchen, of their life together. He'd read a card, remember the taste of her apple brown Betty, the way she'd laughed when he stole a piece before it cooled. But he never gave the box to Catherine. He couldn't. It felt like the last sacred piece of Sarah he had left, and to share it would be to finally, truly let her go. So he would close the lid and place it back on the mantel. A man caught between a memory he couldn't release and a future he had cautiously invited in. If Thomas wrestled with ghosts, Emma battled a living, breathing rival. She obeyed Catherine, but her obedience was brittle, a thin veneer over a deep well of resentment. She saw every mended shirt, every warm meal, as an act of replacement. She was the self-appointed guardian of her mother's legacy, and she would not surrender it. Her rebellion was a thing of quiet, calculated defiance. When Catherine asked her to fetch water, Emma would take her time, returning long after the pot had boiled dry. When Catherine pinned her hair back from her face, Emma would pull the pins out the moment she was out of sight. Her favorite weapon was her loyalty to her mother's memory. "My mama used to make biscuits so light they'd float off your plate," she'd announced to no one in particular while Catherine served her perfectly good, but decidedly earthbound version. Catherine absorbed these small rebellions with a patience that infuriated the girl. She never raised her voice, never complained to Thomas. She simply carried on, her persistence a steady, quiet current against Emma's rocky resistance. The conflict came to a head on a bright, cold afternoon. Catherine was inside, kneading dough, while the girls were playing in the yard. Through the window, she saw Emma whisper something to Lucy, a mischievous glint in her eye, as she pointed to the tall, sturdy pine at the edge of the clearing. Lucy, who idolized her older sister, nodded eagerly. Catherine watched, her hands stilling in the flower, as Emma gave Lucy a boost onto the lowest branch. "I bet you can't get to the branch that looks like a crooked arm," Emma challenged, her voice carrying on the thin air. Lucy, small and fearless, began to climb. She scrambled up, her little legs finding purchase on the rough bark. But the crooked arm branch was higher than it looked. She reached it, flushed with victory. But then she made the mistake of looking down. The world tilted. The ground seemed to drop away. A whimper escaped her lips. "I can't get down," she cried, her voice trembling. Emma's bravado vanished, replaced by a pale mask of fear. "Just come down the way you went up," she called, her own voice high and shaky. Catherine was already moving. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked out onto the porch, her steps measured, her face calm. She didn't shout. She walked to the base of the tree and looked up. "You did a fine job climbing, Lucy," she said, her voice even and reassuring. "Now, just listen to me. Move your left foot down to that little nub of a branch right below you. That's it. Now your right hand, slow and steady." Guided by the calm voice from below, Lucy navigated her way back down, her panic subsiding with each successful move. When she was low enough, Catherine reached up and swung her to the ground. The little girl's face was streaked with tears and dirt, and there was a long, angry scrape on her knee where it had dragged against the bark. She threw her arms around Catherine's waist and sobbed. Catherine held her close, stroking her hair. She looked over Lucy's head at Emma, who stood frozen, her face a mixture of guilt and defiance. Catherine waited until Lucy's sobs quieted before she cleaned and bandaged the scraped knee. Only then did she address the older girl. "Emma," she said softly, but with an unmistakable firmness, "your sister trusts you. She looks to you to keep her safe. It is a great responsibility to be the older sister." She paused, letting the words sink in. "It is not your job to lead her into trouble. It is your job to protect her from it." She didn't say any more. She didn't need to. Emma stood with her head bowed, staring at the scuffed toes of her boots. In her hand, she clutched a small, crudely carved wooden doll with a painted-on smile. Rosie, the last present her father had given her before the storm, before Catherine. For a moment, she looked like what she was, not a fierce guardian of memory, but a lonely 7-year-old girl who had made a mistake. That evening, a fragile truce seemed to settle over the cabin. Emma was subdued, helping set the table without being asked. After dinner, as Thomas was reading to Lucy from a worn book of fables, Catherine sat at the table with her mending basket. The light from the lantern cast a warm, golden glow on the room. "Thomas," she said quietly. He looked up from his book. "You told me once that she made wonderful apple tarts." He blinked, surprised by the direct mention of her name. It was a name they rarely spoke, a ghost that lived between their words. "She did," he said, his voice a little thick. "The best in the county." "I've never had a good hand with pastry," Catherine confessed, looking down at the socks she was darning. "It always comes out tough." She looked over at Emma, who was pretending to be absorbed in arranging and rearranging Rosie's yarn hair. "Emma, your father says you used to help your mother in the kitchen. I wonder, would you know the secret to her pastry?" The question was a peace offering, wrapped in humility. She wasn't asking to replace Sarah. She was asking to learn from her, with Emma as the teacher. Emma looked up, her expression guarded. She saw no trickery in Catherine's face, only a genuine request. For a long moment, she said nothing, the silence stretching taut. Thomas held his breath. Then, in a small, quiet voice, Emma began to speak. "Mama always said the secret was the lard. It had to be cold, ice cold, and you cut it in with 2 knives, not your hands, so it doesn't melt." As she spoke, a flicker of the old, happy memories lit her face, and she'd add a splash of vinegar. She said it made it flaky. Catherine listened intently, nodding. "Vinegar? I never would have thought of that." She smiled, a small, genuine smile. Perhaps tomorrow you could show me if we have any apples left in the cellar." Emma stared at her for another long moment. The war was still raging inside her, but one small battle had been won. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Then she looked down at the table, at the neatly folded dishcloths, at the warm, steaming kettle on the stove. She looked at her sister, sleeping peacefully with a clean bandage on her knee. The home her mother had built was gone, but this woman was building something new in its place. It was different, but it was warm, and it was safe. "Thank you, Catherine," she whispered, the words so quiet they were almost lost in the crackle of the fire. But they weren't. Catherine heard them. Thomas heard them. They landed in the quiet room not as a surrender, but as the first, tentative step onto a newly built bridge. Trust didn't mean forgetting the past. It just meant making room for someone to sit beside it. With the passing of the snow came the great thaw. The valley, once a silent expanse of white, began to breathe again. The gurgle of the creek returned, and patches of dark. Rich earth emerged on the sun-facing slopes. The air, still crisp, carried the scent of damp soil and the promise of spring. Inside the cabin, a similar thawing was underway. The fragile bridge built by Emma's quiet thank you had held, and the days that followed were marked by a tentative, growing peace. The focal point of this new season became the plot of land beside the cabin Sarah's garden. It was a ruin, a testament to a year of neglect. Dead stalks stood like brittle skeletons, and a thick mat of weeds choked the raised beds. For Thomas, it had been a place of pain, a living monument to his failure to keep her world alive. He had avoided even looking at it. It was Catherine who finally broke the silence. She stood on the porch one morning, a cup of coffee warming her hands, her gaze fixed on the tangled plot. "There's good sun on that land," she said, her tone practical, not wistful. "It would be a shame to let it go to waste. The girls need their vegetables this summer." She was offering him a way to approach it not as a shrine, but as a resource, a way to move forward by tending the very ground where they had stalled. Thomas looked at the garden, then at Catherine, and for the first time, he saw not a desecration of memory, but a possibility. "You're right," he said, the words feeling heavy and light at once. And so, the work began. It became a family affair, a daily ritual after the morning chores were done. Thomas, with his broad shoulders and unyielding strength, turned the soil with a heavy spade, his boots sinking into the dark earth. He pulled the stubborn roots of the larger weeds, tossing them onto a growing pile to be burned. The physical labor was a balm, a way to work through the knots of grief and guilt that still resided deep within him. Catherine, with a patient, discerning eye, worked on her knees, her fingers sifting through the soil. She taught the girls to tell the difference between a weed and a dormant perennial. Lucy, delighted by the wriggling earthworms, was a chaotic but enthusiastic helper. Emma was more reserved, her movements mirroring Catherine's. She watched, she learned, her previous resentment slowly being tilled under like the winter-hardened ground. One afternoon, as Catherine was clearing a particularly dense patch of chickweed, her fingers brushed against something tough and fibrous. She worked carefully, pulling back the weeds to reveal a network of runners, pale and thin, but undeniably alive. From them, tiny, serrated green leaves were just beginning to unfurl. "Emma, come look," she called softly. The girl knelt beside her. "What is it?" "Strawberries," Catherine said, a note of wonder in her voice. "They survived the winter, hidden under all this." Emma touched a small leaf with the tip of her finger. A flicker of a memory crossed her face. Mama loved strawberries. She used to make jam every June. It was a simple statement, offered without accusation. It was a sharing. Catherine looked at the stubborn, living roots, a symbol of the quiet, tenacious hope that could persist even in the most neglected corners. "Then we will take special care of them," she said, "so you can have strawberry jam again." They worked together to clear the bed, freeing the dormant plants. As they did, they uncovered other survivors, the hardy, woody stems of a lavender bush, the faint, oniony scent of chives, and in the most protected corner, a cluster of rose bushes, their thorny canes showing the first blush of green buds. "Those were her roses," Emma said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It was a sacred space." Catherine nodded, understanding. "We won't move them," she said. "This corner will be for Sarah's roses." That evening, a thought took root in Thomas's mind. He went to his workshop and found a smooth, straight-grained piece of cedar. By the light of a lantern, he began to carve. He was not a delicate craftsman, but his hands were steady. He carved her name, Sarah, into the wood, and below it, the years of her life. It was not a gravestone, but a marker, a sign that this garden, this land, remembered her. When he showed it to Catherine, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding that went deeper than words. She had not asked him to forget. She had, in her own gentle way, helped him find a way to remember. As the garden took shape, Catherine spent her evening sketching a plan on a piece of brown paper. She kept the good bones of the garden, the rose corner, the strawberry patch, but she added new lines for rows of beans, squash, and corn. She was designing their future, a future that honored the past but was not trapped by it. But as their small world in the valley began to blossom, the world outside it began to take notice. Redemption was a town built on hard rock and harder gossip. A new wife for the widower McKenna, a woman who had appeared out of a blizzard, was a topic of intense speculation. Their first trip to town as a family for Sunday service was an ordeal. As they walked toward the small white church, a hush fell over the groups of people gathered outside. Eyes followed them, and whispers skittered through the air like dry leaves. Catherine, in her best mended dress, her head held high, felt the weight of their scrutiny. She kept her focus on the girls, holding Lucy's hand and giving Emma's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. Inside, they sat in the McKenna family pew. Catherine was acutely aware of the woman sitting behind them, Mrs. Hart, the preacher's wife and the town's self-appointed moral compass. Her stage whisper was a potent weapon, appeared from thin air. They say, a woman alone. You know what that usually means. Thomas's back went rigid. He laid a large, protective hand on Catherine's arm. The preacher's sermon on forgiveness and charity felt hollow, the words bouncing off the thick walls of judgment that surrounded them. The most pointed threat, however, came not from the whispers of pious women, but from the calculating gaze of a powerful man. Silas Boone was the foreman of the largest silver mine in the district, a man whose ambition was as vast and unyielding as the mountains themselves. He was large, barrel-chested, with eyes that missed nothing and a smile that never reached them. He owned half the town and held a mortgage on the other half. He had long coveted Thomas's land, not for the homestead, but for the tall stands of timber and the clear, steady creek that ran through it, resources his ever-expanding mine desperately needed. He had tried to buy Thomas out after Sarah's death, assuming grief had weakened him, but Thomas had refused. Boone approached them after the service, his large frame blocking the sun. "McKenna," he said, his voice a low rumble. He tipped his hat to Catherine, his eyes lingering on her for a moment too long. A silent, insolent appraisal. "I see you found company, a comfort in your time of grieving. I'm sure." "This is my wife, Catherine," Thomas said, his voice flat and hard as granite. "Of course," Boone said, his smile widening. "Heard you had a judge out to the valley? Quick work. A man with 2 young girls can't be too careful about who he brings into his home. Reputation is everything out here." The veiled threat was unmistakable. Later that week, Thomas had to go into town for supplies. He left reluctantly, but their stores of salt and coffee were low. He was in the general store when Boone and 2 of his cronies came in, their laughter loud and coarse. They headed for the saloon next door, and through the connecting doorway, Thomas could hear their voices. He tried to ignore it, focusing on his list. But Silas's voice was carrying, "Takes in a stray." And next thing you know, she's got his name. A woman with a history. "I hear. Word travels from the camps. McKenna lived with a fella down near Fairplay. Had a kid with him, too, without the benefit of a preacher." The store went quiet. Thomas's knuckles were white where he gripped a sack of flour. He could feel every eye in the room on him. He finished his business, his movements stiff, paid the clerk, and walked toward the door. He had to pass the saloon entrance. He could have kept walking, but the insult to Catherine, the deliberate sullying of her name and his home, was something he couldn't let stand. He stopped in the doorway, his tall frame filling it. The saloon fell silent. Boone was leaning against the bar, a smirk on his face. "Boone," Thomas said, his voice dangerously quiet. "My wife's name is not fit for a place like this. Or for your mouth. I'll thank you to keep it out of both." Boone chuckled, a low, condescending sound. A man's got a right to be protective of his property, but you'd be wise to make sure your property is worth protecting. He was goading him, hoping for a fight, a public spectacle that would further isolate Thomas. Before Thomas could respond, a voice cut through the tension. "She's worth more than the whole lot of you put together." The voice belonged to Mary Henderson, a tough, no-nonsense widow who ran a small homestead on the other side of the valley from Thomas. She was standing near the back, having come in for a beer after a long day's work, a rare indulgence. She set her glass down with a thud and walked forward, her eyes blazing. She fixed her gaze on Boone's cronies. "I see you men sitting in here day after day, while your own kids run ragged in the street. I passed Thomas's place last week. I saw his girls. Their clothes were mended, their hair was brushed, and they were laughing while they pulled weeds in a garden." She turned her fiery gaze on Silas Boone. "That woman, Catherine, is doing the one thing that matters in this world. She's making a home. She's caring for 2 motherless children with more grace and grit than I've seen in this town in a long time. So you can take your slime and your rumors, and you can crawl back under the rock you came from. Her honor comes from her work, not from the wagging tongues of idle men." A stunned silence filled the saloon. No one had ever spoken to Silas Boone like that. He was so taken aback, so utterly flummoxed by this frontal assault from an unexpected quarter, that he was momentarily speechless. Mary Henderson turned and walked out, her back straight as a fence post. Thomas gave Boone one last, cold look, then turned and followed her, leaving the men in the saloon to stare into their drinks. He caught up with her on the boardwalk. "Mary," he said, "you didn't have to do that." She snorted. "Yes, I did. I can't abide a bully, and I know a good woman when I see one. You tell your Catherine that if she ever needs a cup of sugar or a friendly face, my door is always open." She gave him a sharp nod and went on her way. The ride home was quiet, the shadow of the town, of Boone's malice and the town's judgment, rode with him. But it was joined by a small, bright flame of hope. They were not entirely alone. A community, like a garden, had its weeds, but it also had its hardy, unexpected blossoms. A heart had a way of making itself known. If only someone was brave enough to start the beat. He knew the fight was far from over. Silas Boone was not a man to forget a public humiliation. He would use Catherine's past as a weapon to get what he wanted. But as Thomas topped the rise and saw the light glowing in his cabin window, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was a home he would fight for. The summer deepened. Settling into the valley with the warmth of a contented sigh, the garden, once a plot of weeds and sorrow, was now a riot of life. Green bean vines climbed their poles, the fat globes of squash ripened under broad leaves, and the strawberry patch, coaxed back to life, was dotted with the promise of red fruit. The work had bound them together, their shared labor turning the soil of their arrangement into the foundation of a family. Even Emma's smiles, once rare and fleeting, were becoming more frequent, especially when she worked alongside Catherine, her hands in the same earth. But peace in the high country was often as fragile as a wildflower. It could be crushed in an instant. The man who rode into their valley one searing August afternoon did not belong. He wore a dark city suit, filmed with the dust of the trail, and sat his horse with the unease of someone more accustomed to a desk chair. He dismounted at their gate and approached the cabin with a leather folio under his arm. Thomas met him on the porch, his posture immediately wary. Catherine came to the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron, the girls peering out from behind her skirts. "Mr. Thomas McKenna," the man asked, his voice polite but firm. "I am. My name is Davies. I'm a clerk with the district court in Denver." He opened his folio. "I'm here on a small matter regarding a bank account established some years ago in Leadville. I've been sent to locate a Mrs. Catherine Walsh." He looked at Catherine, his eyes assessing, or, as she may have been known then, Catherine Morrison. The name fell into the warm summer air like a shard of ice. Morrison. The name from her past. The one she had confessed to Thomas in the cold light of a winter morning. It had been a ghost then, a whispered secret between them. Now, it was here, spoken aloud by a man of the law on their doorstep. Catherine felt the blood drain from her face. Emma's small hand, which had been resting in hers, slipped away. Thomas's expression became unreadable, his face hardening into the stoic mask he once wore, the fragile peace shattered. "I am Catherine Walsh," she said, her voice a thin thread in the sudden, heavy silence. "Mr. Davies consulted his papers. It seems an account belonging to a Mr. James Morrison has lain dormant for some time. Recently, activities related to a larger estate have brought it to the court's attention. Our records show an inquiry was made about this account 3 years ago by a woman matching your description and using your former name. We are simply clarifying the details as part of a larger investigation into a series of financial irregularities in the territory." He wasn't accusing her of anything directly, but the implications hung in the air. Irregularities. Investigation. Former name, asterisk. He asked a series of questions, which she answered in a low, steady voice, explaining her past connection to James Morrison, a truth that now felt sordid and damning under the official scrutiny of the law. When the clerk finally tipped his hat and rode away, he left behind a silence more profound than any storm. Thomas did not look at her. He turned and walked to the barn, his shoulders rigid. The emotional wall she had so patiently dismantled over the past months was rebuilt in an instant, thicker and colder than before. She was no longer Catherine, his wife, the woman who had brought life back to his home. She was Catherine Morrison, a name from a bank ledger, a woman with a past that had followed them home. News, like a grass fire, travels fast in a small town. "Mr. Davies stopped at the Redemption Saloon for a drink to wash the trail dust from his throat before catching the evening stage. He was not a discreet man. Within the hour, Silas Boone knew everything, and what he knew, he twisted. By nightfall, the story had been shaped into a sharp and vicious weapon. McKenna's new wife wasn't just a woman with a past. She was a thief, wanted by the law for embezzling money from a dead man's account. The poison reached the valley the next day. Thomas, his face grim, heard it when he went to the creek to check his water gate. 2 miners, seeing him, stopped talking abruptly, their expressions a mixture of pity and contempt. He didn't need to hear the words to know their content. He was the fool who had taken in a viper. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on him, stealing the air from his lungs. His fear was not for himself, but for his daughters. What would this do to them? How could they hold their heads up in town? As the daughters of a common criminal, he retreated into himself, into a cold, silent fury. He worked from sunup to sundown, speaking only when necessary, his words clipped and hard. At the dinner table, he would not meet Catherine's eyes. The trust he had offered her on the porch that winter morning had been founded on her kindness. Now, confronted with the official-looking papers and the sneers of the town, that trust wavered, battered by his own wounded pride. Catherine's heart ached with every silent meal, every averted glance. She knew what he was thinking. She knew what the town was saying. She also knew that remaining in the valley, a prisoner of his silence and their judgment, would solve nothing. The truth was in Denver, and she had to go to it. That night, she packed a small bag with a change of clothes and the last of the money she had saved from her previous life. She found Thomas by the hearth, staring into the flames. "I am going to Denver," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He looked up, his face shadowed. Running again, the words were cold, cutting. "No," she said, her chin rising. "I am not running. I am going to face this. I am going to speak to the judge and clear my name, your name, and the girl's name." She looked at him, her eyes pleading. "I told you the truth of my past. Thomas, I have never lied to you. He was silent for a long time. "And if they don't believe you, if Boone's version of the story is the one that sticks, then I will not come back," she whispered, the words tearing at her. "I will not bring that shame to your door again." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "It's already here." He stood up and went to a small wooden chest in the corner, a chest she had never seen him open. He took out a tarnished silver medal attached to a faded ribbon, his service medal from the war. He held it in his palm, his thumb rubbing the embossed eagle. It was a relic from a time when honor was simple, when the enemy was clear, when courage meant charging a line of guns, not weathering a storm of whispers. He looked from the medal to her, and his eyes were full of a pain so deep she could barely stand to see it. He put the medal away and closed the chest. "Do what you must," he said, and walked out into the night. Her departure the next morning was agony. Lucy clung to her, sobbing, not understanding why she had to leave. Emma was pale and silent, but her eyes, those stormy gray eyes so like her father's, were wide with a fear she refused to voice. Catherine knelt and held them both, burying her face in their hair, breathing in the scent of them. "I will be back," she promised, her voice thick with tears. "I promise." Mary Henderson, her face a mask of grim resolve, was waiting with her wagon to take Catherine to the stagecoach station. As they pulled away, Catherine looked back at the cabin. Thomas stood on the porch, a solitary, unmoving figure, a man trapped between his pride and his heart. With Catherine gone, a heavy, oppressive silence descended on the cabin. Silas Boone did not wait long. He rode out 2 days later, his manner oozing of false sympathy. "A terrible business. McKenna," he said, dismounting. "To be betrayed like that. A man in your position can't be too careful." He produced a folded document from his coat. "Look, I know you've got your hands full. I've been meaning to talk to you about a timber contract. I need to clear a new shaft, and that stand of pine on your north ridge would be perfect. I'll pay you a fair price. It might help, with your new troubles." Thomas, numb and distracted, took the papers. It was a simple timber sale agreement, several pages long. He scanned the first page. The price was fair. He was in no state to argue, or even to think clearly. "I'll leave it with you," Boone said smoothly. "Sign it, and my man will bring you the money tomorrow." He gestured vaguely toward the creek. "The contract just includes standard access clauses, of course, to get the timber out." What Thomas didn't see, buried in the dense legal language on the third page, was a clause granting Boone's mining company unlimited and permanent water rights to the creek that was the lifeblood of his homestead, the very heart of his small valley. It was a thief's contract, delivered with a sympathetic smile. That evening, Thomas sat at the table, the contract spread before him, a pen in his hand. The girls were asleep. The house was deathly quiet. He felt adrift, his anchor of trust gone, his pride in tatters. Signing the papers felt like something to do, a simple action in a world that had become impossibly complex. What did the timber matter now, anyway? Just as he dipped the pen in the inkwell, there was a knock at the door. It was Mary Henderson, her face illuminated by the lantern she carried. "Thomas," she said, stepping inside, "I just came from town. The evening stage brought a letter." She handed him a folded, slightly crumpled envelope. It was addressed to him in Catherine's neat, careful script. He stared at it, his heart hammering in his chest. He opened it with trembling fingers. The letter was short. Asterisk, "My dearest Thomas." Asterisk, "The journey is long, but it gives me time to think. I'm sorry for the trouble I have brought to your door, and for the pain this has caused you. I understand your silence. You gave me your trust, and now it seems the world is telling you that trust was misplaced. Asterisk, I am not writing to beg you to believe me. I am writing to tell you that I am going to face this, for myself and for the girls. I will make the truth known, and I want you to know, whether you can find it in your heart to welcome me back or not. I will keep a warm home for Emma and Lucy in my own heart. Always. They are my daughters, too. Asterisk yours, Catherine. The simple, honest words cut through the ice of his pride and fear. He read the letter again, hearing her voice, remembering her patience, her quiet strength, the way her presence had mended the broken pieces of their lives. He looked at Boone's deceitful contract on the table, then at the letter in his hand. One was a lie wrapped in the language of the law. The other was the truth, written in the plain language of the heart. He didn't realize Emma was standing in the doorway to the bedroom until she spoke, her small voice cutting through the quiet. "Is that from Catherine?" she asked. Thomas nodded, unable to speak. She came and stood beside him, her small hand resting on his arm. She looked at the contract on the table, then at her father's tormented face. She had been watching him, feeling his pain, his confusion. She knew what the men in town were saying, but she also knew the woman who had taught her to bake, who had tended her sister's scraped knee, who had promised to come back. "You have to go get her. Papa," she said, her voice filled with a child's unshakable clarity. "Mister, Boone is a bad man. Catherine is not. You have to fight for her." She squeezed his arm. "You have to fight for our family." Asterisk our family. The word struck him with the force of a physical blow. Emma, his fierce, loyal Emma, had claimed Catherine as their own. In that moment, the choice became devastatingly clear. His pride was a small, petty thing compared to the truth his daughter saw so plainly. His duty was not to his wounded ego, but to the woman who had signed her letter. Asterisk yours, Catherine. And to the family they had built. He stood up, his back straight, the hesitation and doubt gone from his eyes. He looked at Mary. "Can you stay with the girls?" Mary's weathered face broke into a fierce grin. "For as long as you need." Thomas folded Catherine's letter and tucked it into his shirt pocket. Placing it next to his heart, he crumpled Silas Boone's contract into a tight ball and threw it into the fire. The paper blackened, curled, and then burst into flame, a fitting end to a coward's lie. He was going to Denver. The battle for his family had just begun. The courtroom in Denver was a world away from the quiet valley. It smelled of stale cigar smoke, old paper, and the nervous sweat of men whose fates rested on the word of the law. Catherine sat on a hard wooden bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She felt small and exposed under the stern, assessing gaze of Judge Abernathy, a man whose face seemed carved from the same granite as the mountains. For 2 days, she had answered his questions, her voice low and steady as she recounted the painful history of her life with James Morrison, the prosecuting attorney, a sharp man with eyes like a hawk, twisted her words, painting a picture of a cunning woman who had preyed on a wealthy man and was now connected to a complex case of financial fraud. Catherine's simple, honest account of a past love and a desperate, small inquiry about a loan felt flimsy against the weight of his accusations. The whispers from the spectators followed her, sticking to her like burrs. She was alone, a solitary woman against the impersonal machinery of justice. On the morning of the 3rd day, as the attorney was reaching the peak of his damning summation, the heavy courtroom doors swung open. A collective gasp and a ripple of murmurs went through the room. Standing in the doorway was Thomas. He held Lucy, who was clutching his neck, her face buried in his shoulder. Beside him, holding his other hand, stood Emma, her back straight, her chin held high, her stormy gray eyes sweeping the room with a defiant glare. They were not dressed for the city. They wore their simple, clean homestead clothes, smelling of fresh air and pine, an island of mountain truth in a sea of city lies. Thomas's gaze found Catherine. He gave her a single, steady nod, a silent message that traveled across the crowded room. Asterisk, I am here. You are not alone. He walked down the central aisle, his boots echoing on the wooden floorboards. He did not take a seat in the back. He walked all the way to the front and stood directly behind the bench where Catherine sat. He placed a hand on her shoulder. It was a simple, public declaration, more powerful than any testimony. "This is my wife. This is my family. We stand with her." The whispering died instantly. The sight of them, of Thomas's unwavering presence, of Emma's fierce loyalty, of Lucy's trusting form was like a draught of pure, cold mountain water. Catherine's spine straightened. The fear that had been coiling in her stomach for days loosened its grip. She was no longer just Catherine Morrison, a name in a ledger. She was Catherine McKenna, a wife and a mother. She had a home, and it was here, fighting for her. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. While justice was being weighed in Denver, a cruder, more violent form of ambition was playing out in the valley. Silas Boone stood on the bank of the creek, a lit cigar clenched in his teeth, and watched as his men worked. With the McKennas gone, the valley was his to plunder. "More dynamite in that fissure?" He barked at one of his men. "I want this creek bed moved by noon. The stamp mill needs the water, and I'm not waiting for a court order." His men, rough miners who were paid for their silence and their strength, drilled into the rock shelf that formed the narrowest part of the canyon. They packed the holes with dynamite, running fuses back to the ridge. Silas felt a surge of triumph. He had driven the woman out with rumors and would now steal the heart of the man's land while he was away. By the time McKenna returned, his creek would be a dry ditch, and his homestead would be worthless. He would have no choice but to sell, for pennies on the dollar. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Back in the courtroom, Judge Abernathy was looking at the case with new eyes. The arrival of McKenna and his children had changed the tenor of the room. This was no longer about a shadowy woman from a dubious past. It was about a family. The judge, a man who had seen every form of human depravity, was also a shrewd reader of character. He looked at Thomas's resolute face and at Catherine's newfound strength. He began to question the prosecutor's evidence more sharply. "So this grand conspiracy you've concocted," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "hinges on a single inquiry made by a desperate woman 3 years ago regarding a loan against an account she believed her partner held. An inquiry that was, in fact, denied." From outside, the lonesome whistle of a train echoed through the open windows, the sound of the modern world, of telegraphs and federal marshals, of a law that was slowly but surely reaching into the wild corners of the territory. The judge shuffled through the papers. "It seems far more likely to me," he boomed, "that this woman, Mrs. McKenna, was an unwitting pawn. It is clear there is a ring of thieves operating out of Leadville, using names like Morrison to test the defenses of dormant accounts before striking. Her past misfortunes simply made her an easy target for your speculation." He banged his gavel, the sound cracking like a rifle shot. "Case against Catherine McKenna is dismissed. I am issuing a warrant for the arrest of the bank clerks in Leadville who seem to be the real culprits. This woman is not a perpetrator. She is a victim. She is free to go." A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled her knees washed over Catherine. Thomas's hand squeezed her shoulder, his strength flowing into her. It was over. She was innocent. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The journey home was a blur of joy and exhaustion. They took the train halfway, a noisy, clattering marvel that thrilled the girls and symbolized their swift return to the life they had almost lost. As they rattled through the foothills, the sky began to bruise with the dark purples of a summer storm. By the time they transferred to a wagon for the final leg of the journey, the clouds had burst. Rain, thick and heavy, turned the trail to mud, and small pellets of hail began to ping against the canvas cover. In the valley, Silas Boone looked up at the darkening sky with satisfaction. A good storm would wash away the evidence of his work. "Light the fuses," he yelled over the rising wind. The fuses hissed. The men ran for cover. The resulting explosion was a deafening roar that echoed off the canyon walls. Tons of rock and earth cascaded into the narrow gorge, creating a crude, effective dam. The creek, which had been rising with the heavy rain, now had nowhere to go. Behind the rockfall, the water began to swell, turning from a stream into a deep, churning, angry lake. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. When the McKenna's wagon rounded the final bend into their canyon, Thomas pulled the horses to a sudden, wrenching halt. The sight before them was apocalyptic. Where their gentle creek had flowed, there was now a raging brown torrent, a flash flood that had breached the makeshift dam and was tearing through the canyon. The wooden bridge, their only way across to the cabin, was submerged, its support beams groaning and splintering under the immense pressure of the floodwaters. And on the far side, trapped between the flood and the steep canyon walls, were Silas Boone and his 2 men. They had been caught by the very destruction they had unleashed. Their faces were masks of terror as they watched the water rise, cutting off their escape. "The bridge is going!" Emma screamed. There was no time to think, no time for debate. The entire structure shuddered, and a section of railing was torn away. "We cross now," Thomas commanded, his voice a roar that cut through the storm. "It's our only chance to get home." He leaped from the wagon, pulling a terrified Lucy into his arms. "Catherine, you take Emma's hand and don't you let go. Stay right behind me. Don't look down." He plunged onto the bridge, his boots sinking into the submerged planks. The structure swayed violently beneath him. Lucy buried her face in his neck, her small body trembling. Behind him, Catherine and Emma followed, their hands locked in a desperate grip. The water, cold and powerful, swirled around their legs, trying to pull them down. They were halfway across when a massive log, carried by the current, slammed into the bridge's central support. The sound of cracking timber was like a gunshot. The bridge sagged, dropping several feet. Emma screamed, but Catherine held fast, pulling her forward. "Keep moving," she yelled. They reached the other side, scrambling onto the muddy bank just as the main section of the bridge they had just crossed tore loose from its foundations and was devoured by the flood. They were safe. But Silas Boone was not. The bank on which he stood was being eaten away by the current. As they watched, the ground crumbled beneath his feet. With a cry of terror, he fell, managing only to grab hold of a splintered piling from the bridge's edge, the raging water pulling at his legs. His men stood helpless, unable to reach him. His eyes, wide with panic, met Thomas's across the churning water. In that moment, he was not the arrogant mine foreman, the thief, the rumor monger. He was just a man about to die. Thomas didn't hesitate. He handed Lucy to Catherine. "Keep the girls back," he ordered. He grabbed a coil of rope from his wagon, tied it around his waist, and gave the other end to Catherine. "Hold on, no matter what." He crept to the edge of the collapsing bank. "Boone," he shouted, "give me your hand." Silas, his strength failing, could only stare in disbelief. Thomas McKenna, the man whose life he had tried to destroy, was offering to save him. He reached out a trembling hand. Thomas lay flat on the slick mud, stretching as far as he could. Their fingers brushed, then locked. "Pull!" Thomas yelled, with Catherine and a terrified but determined Emma acting as anchors on the rope. Thomas hauled with all his might. The bank gave way further, but the grip held. He dragged Silas Boone, sputtering and soaked, onto solid ground just as the last of the bridge piling was ripped away and vanished into the flood. They lay there for a moment, gasping for breath on the muddy bank. The 4 McKennas and the man who had tried to ruin them, bound together by a shared survival and an act of impossible grace. The roar of the flood was the only sound. The bridge between their homes was gone, destroyed by greed. But another bridge, stronger than wood and stone, had just been built in its place, a bridge of mercy. Extended in the heart of the storm, justice could wait. In the wild heart of the West, humanity sometimes had to come first. The aftermath of the flood was a world of mud and ruin. The creek, though receding, was still a wounded, angry brown, its banks torn and bleeding. The bridge was gone, leaving a raw, impassable gap. On the cabin side of the canyon, a strange, sodden silence held the 5 survivors. Silas Boone sat slumped against a rock, the arrogance washed out of him, leaving only a shivering, defeated man. His 2 cronies stood apart, their gazes averted, shame and fear warring on their faces. Thomas moved with a grim, deliberate purpose. He got a fire roaring in the cabin's hearth and had Catherine take the girls inside to get warm and dry. He returned with 2 blankets, tossing one to Boone without a word. The gesture was not of kindness, but of a basic mountain decency that even Boone's treachery could not extinguish. "You will pay for a new bridge, Boone," Thomas said, his voice low and flat, devoid of anger. It was the voice of a man stating an undeniable fact. "You will pay for a crew to clear my creek bed of the rock you put in it, and you will stand up in front of the whole town come Sunday, and you will tell them what you did. You will tell them you lied about my wife, and you will apologize to her." Boone looked up, his face a mess of mud and humiliation. He saw no room for negotiation in Thomas's eyes. He had been beaten not by fists, but by the quiet strength of a man he had fatally underestimated. He gave a single, jerky nod. The news of what had happened in the canyon of Boone's crime and Thomas's act of mercy traveled faster than the receding floodwaters. When the McKennas arrived in Redemption for church the following Sunday, the town's atmosphere had profoundly changed. The whispers that had once followed them were replaced by nods of respect. The eyes that had been filled with suspicion now held a grudging admiration. As promised, after the final hymn, Silas Boone stood before the congregation. His voice was low and hoarse, but it carried in the silent church. He confessed to spreading false rumors about Catherine and to attempting to illegally divert the creek for his mind's benefit. He publicly apologized to Catherine, his eyes fixed on the floorboards. It was a humiliating spectacle. And for Catherine, it was the final closing of a painful chapter. The town's judgment, once a heavy cloak, had dissolved. She was no longer the stranger who came in a storm. She was Mrs. McKenna, a woman of proven character. A week later, a letter arrived from Denver. It was from Judge Abernathy. The investigation had been swift. The corrupt bank clerks in Leadville had been arrested, and a wider conspiracy to defraud dormant accounts was being untangled. The letter contained a surprising addendum. James Morrison's account, while small, was not empty. As he had no other legal heirs and Catherine's past association was the only one on record, the court had ruled to release the remaining funds to her. It wasn't a fortune, but to a woman who had owned nothing. It was a significant sum. She held the bank draft in her hand, the last tangible link to her life as Catherine Morrison. She could have used the money for 100 things: a new stove, better clothes for the girls, a milk cow. But she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that this money was not truly hers. It belonged to the past, and her own future was already provided for. That evening, she sat at the table and, by the light of the lamp, wrote a letter. She addressed it to a Mrs. Eleanor Morrison in a town in Ohio, a name and address she had found tucked away in an old ledger of James's. Asterisk, "Dear Mrs. Morrison," she wrote, her pen moving steadily. Asterisk, "You do not know me, but my life was once briefly entangled with that of your husband, James. I write to you now not to cause pain, but to close a circle. The enclosed bank draft is from an account he held here in the West. It is legally mine, but morally, I feel it belongs to you. May it bring you some small peace. I wish you a quiet and good life." She signed it simply, Asterisk Catherine McKenna, Asterisk. She folded the letter and the draft and placed them in an envelope. Thomas, who had been watching her from his chair by the fire, said nothing. But the look on his face, a mixture of pride, respect, and a love so deep it needed no words, was all the affirmation she needed. With that act of quiet justice, she had finally, completely forgiven herself. She was free. Life in the valley settled into a new, more joyful rhythm. As part of his penance, Boone's crew, under Thomas's direction, rebuilt the bridge, its new timbers thick and strong. They cleared the creek, and the water once again ran clear and cool over the familiar stones. The garden, nurtured by the summer sun and the storm's rain, thrived. The rose bushes that had been Sarah's were covered in deep, fragrant red blooms. The bean vines were heavy with pods, and the strawberry patch was a carpet of green leaves and jewel-like red fruit. One warm afternoon, Catherine and the girls were in the patch, their fingers stained red from the sweet juice. Lucy was eating more berries than she put in the pail, her face a sticky, happy mess. Emma, however, worked with a focused diligence, carefully selecting the ripest, most perfect berries. "These are the best we've ever had," Emma said, holding one up to the light. She paused, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Mama used to say that the first strawberries of the season tasted like sunshine." It was a memory, offered freely, a gift. It was not a comparison or a challenge. "I think she was right," Catherine said softly, her heart swelling. Emma looked at Catherine, her stormy gray eyes clear and direct. A decision, weeks in the making, had finally been reached. "Catherine," she began, her voice a little hesitant. Is it all right if I call you Mama Catherine?" The question, so earnestly and bravely asked, was the one thing Catherine had never dared to hope for. Tears welled in her eyes as she pulled the young girl into a fierce, loving hug. "Oh, Emma," she whispered into her hair, "there is nothing in this world I would like more." From the edge of the garden, Thomas watched them, and a feeling of such profound gratitude washed over him that it felt like a prayer being answered. That evening, the cabin was filled with the warm, sweet scent of baking. Emma, with a seriousness befitting the occasion, showed Catherine exactly how her mother had made the lattice top for the strawberry tarts when they came out of the oven, golden and bubbling. Emma proudly took the first slice to her father. The taste was sweet, the sweetness of a new season, of a family finally made whole. Later, after the girls were asleep, Thomas and Catherine sat on the porch. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the cottonwood trees, and the sky was a deep, velvet blue, littered with stars. The silence between them was no longer one of uncertainty, but of deep, shared contentment. "Catherine," Thomas said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet night. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, which he held in his calloused palm. It was a ring, a simple, unadorned band of gold. It wasn't perfectly round, and the surface was not professionally polished, but it shone with a warm, honest light of its own. "I'm not a jeweler," he said, a rare, shy smile touching his lips. "I had an old gold nugget I found panning years ago. I melted it down and shaped it myself." He took her left hand. Her fingers were stained from the berries, the nails short and clean from her work in the garden. He looked into her eyes, his own gaze clear and full of a feeling he no longer tried to hide. "When I asked you to marry me that first time, it was a bargain," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It was a practical thing. I needed a wife for my girls, and you needed a home. It was an arrangement of convenience." He paused, his thumb gently stroking her knuckles. "I'm asking you to stay now, Catherine, not for convenience. I'm asking you to be my wife, for real this time, because this cabin is not a home without you, because I am not whole without you, because I love you." He slipped the imperfectly perfect gold band onto her finger. It fit as if it were made for her. Tears streamed silently down Catherine's cheeks. She looked down at the ring, and, in the faint starlight, she could see tiny, crudely scratched letters on the inside. She tilted it toward the light from the cabin window to read the inscription, asterisk, chosen with love. She threw her arms around his neck, her heart so full it felt it might burst. "I love you, Thomas McKenna." She sobbed, "I love you." They held each other for a long time, two solitary souls who had found their harbor. When her tears subsided, she pulled back slightly, a new, gentle light in her eyes. She took his large, strong hand and placed it flat against her stomach. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice filled with a quiet, miraculous joy. "There's more. The garden isn't the only thing that's growing." He looked at her, his brow furrowed in confusion for a moment. Then his eyes widened as understanding dawned. A look of pure, unadulterated awe spread across his face, a wonder so profound it seemed to light him from within. He dropped to his knees before her, his hand still resting gently on her belly, and pressed his forehead there. A silent, reverent gesture. The next morning, they told the girls. Lucy, thrilled at the prospect of a baby, clapped her hands in delight. Emma's reaction was quieter, more profound. She looked at Catherine's belly, and then at her face, and a slow, beautiful smile spread across her own. She stepped forward and gave Catherine a careful hug. "Don't you worry about a thing, Mama Catherine," she said, her voice filled with a newfound 7-year-old wisdom. "I'll teach the baby everything important, how to make tarts, and how to skip stones on the creek, and which flowers were Sarah's." Hope, Catherine realized, didn't need to arrive with a thunderclap. Sometimes it grew quietly, patiently, like a strawberry runner under the snow, waiting for its season to come. The autumn that followed was a season of deliberate creation. The sound of Thomas's hammer became a familiar rhythm in the valley, a steady heartbeat echoing off the canyon walls. He was expanding the cabin, adding a new, larger kitchen, according to a set of plans Catherine had drawn on butcher paper. It was her design, born of a deep understanding of the flow of a home, a large window over the sink to look out at the garden, a pantry deep enough to hold a winter's worth of preserves, and a hearth big enough for both cooking and warming chilly feet. He was the builder, the one who gave her vision form with sweat and timber, and their partnership in this was as profound as any vow. While the new room took shape, Thomas spent his evenings in the barn, working on a smaller, more intimate project. By the light of a lantern, he carefully sanded and shaped pieces of fine-grained maple, his large hands moving with a gentle reverence. He was building a cradle. As he worked the wood, smoothing its curves, he thought of the first cradle he had built for Emma, a rougher thing made by a younger man full of anxious, hopeful energy. He thought of Sarah, how she had lined it with a soft spun wool blanket. This new act of creation was not a betrayal of that memory, but a continuation of it. He was not replacing his first family. He was making the house and his heart larger to hold the love he had found again. As Catherine's belly grew, so did the sense of anticipation in the valley. Mary Henderson became a frequent visitor, bringing advice and old baby clothes, her gruff kindness a constant source of comfort. Other women from the town, who had once eyed Catherine with suspicion, now stopped by with small gifts, a jar of spiced apple butter, a hand-knitted blanket. They saw in the McKenna homestead not a scandal, but a story of resilience that resonated with their own hard-won lives. The first snows of winter came, blanketing the valley in a familiar, peaceful white. And in the heart of that quiet, in the warm, expanded cabin, Catherine gave birth to a son. He was a healthy, strong-cradled boy with a fuzz of dark hair and his father's stormy gray eyes. They named him Daniel Samuel McKenna. Daniel, for the memory Catherine had carried in her heart for so long. A name she could now speak with love instead of just sorrow. And Samuel, a name Thomas chose from the Bible, for the child who was an answer to a prayer. When the spring thaw came and the trails were clear, they took Daniel to the church in Redemption to be christened. The small church was fuller than usual. The town had come not just for a Sunday service, but to bear witness. Mary Henderson stood as the baby's godmother, her weathered face beaming. The preacher, Mr. Hart, whose wife had once been so quick to judge, spoke with a new humility. He held up an old, well-worn Bible. "This was Sarah McKenna's Bible," he said, his voice quiet. "And this morning, I want to read the passage she marked." He opened it to a page where a small, pressed columbine flower, the state's wild bloom, was tucked from the Book of Ruth. He read, "Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God." He looked directly at Catherine, who held Daniel in her arms. Sarah marked this passage about loyalty and the forging of a new family from loss. "It seems a fitting blessing for this new life and for this family, which has shown us all the meaning of that verse." After the service, the preacher's wife, Mrs. Hart, gave the pressed flower to Catherine. Catherine accepted it with a quiet thank you, later tucking it into the back of the family Bible, not an erasure of the past, but a joining of it, a blessing passed from one wife to another. Outside the church, the community gathered. Children that Mary Henderson had brought along played tag around the tombstones, their laughter a bright, living sound in the quiet yard. As a final condition of his unofficial probation from the town's good graces, Silas Boone approached them. He was a changed man, thinner, his arrogance replaced by a quiet sobriety. He stood before Catherine and Thomas. "Mrs. McKenna," he said, his voice low and devoid of its former bluster. "Mr. McKenna, I wish you and your family a long and prosperous life, and I am sorry for the wrong I did you." It was not eloquent, but it was sincere. Thomas simply nodded, accepting the apology as the closing of a debt. There was no need for more words. The creek was running clear. The new bridge was strong, and the town had chosen its side. Justice, he had learned, was not about punishment, but about restoration. That evening, the air was soft and cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and new pine needles. The four of them, Thomas, Catherine, Emma, and Lucy, sat on the porch. Daniel was asleep in the new cradle just inside the open door. The sky was fading from pink to a deep indigo. Thomas sat in his customary chair, his arm draped around Catherine's shoulders. Lucy was half asleep in his lap, while Emma sat on the steps, leaning her head against Catherine's knee. Life would still be hard. The winters would be long and brutal. The summers a constant battle against drought and pests. There would be sickness and hardship and loss. They all knew it, but the fear of facing it alone was gone. They had learned to be a family, a choice they made again every single day, with every shared meal, every mended shirt, every bedtime story. They had learned that a past could be honored without being a prison, that the present was a gift to be lived fully, and that the future was something you planted and tended, together. The garden was coming to life, its green shoots a testament to rebirth. The creek, the valley's lifeblood, flowed freely once more. The new bridge was a symbol of their connection to the world, stronger than before. And on Catherine's finger, the simple gold ring Thomas had forged himself was a constant, warm reminder of a promise made not of convenience, but of love. As the first stars began to appear, Emma stirred. "I have something for you," she said, her voice soft. She went inside and returned with a piece of slate. She had been working on it in secret for weeks. She handed it to Catherine. It was a drawing, rendered with a child's simple, heartfelt sincerity. It was their family. On the right was the cabin, with smoke curling from the chimney. In front of it stood a tall man with a smiling little girl on his shoulders, Papa and Lucy. And in the center stood Catherine, holding a bundled baby in her arms. But she was not alone. Floating just above and behind her, nestled in a puffy white cloud, was another woman with a kind, gentle smile and a halo of bright yellow hair. Sarah. She was looking down on them all, her hand seemingly resting on Catherine's shoulder. Beneath the drawing, Emma had painstakingly written a single sentence asterisk, "Our family has 2 mothers in heaven and on earth." Catherine stared at the drawing. tears blurring her vision. She saw in those simple chalk lines the most profound and generous truth. Love was not a thing to be divided. It did not diminish when it was shared. It only grew, making room, expanding the heart to hold more than you ever thought possible. She pulled Emma into a tight hug, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Thomas looked at the drawing over her shoulder, his own eyes shining. He finally understood. You didn't have to let go of one love to embrace another. You just had to build a house big enough, a heart wide enough, for all of it. In the vast, harsh wilderness of the West, amidst the struggle for survival, they had found the truest kind of prosperity, a home where everyone belonged, where every heart had its place, and where every love was remembered. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach more listeners, consider supporting it by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world.